Hi, I'm Divyani. Sorry, I haven't introduced myself before, but it's wonderful to meet you all. And yeah, I just want to just confirm what Aditya is saying. I think it's been a fantastic experience with the couple of webinars that we've had so far. They've been very, very interesting topics, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Devyani.
Hi, Divyani.
So, I'm also in cabin fever in Delhi. So.
Okay. I think we're all in cabin fever right now. And for us too, there's no end in sight because in Los Angeles, there's been an uptick in cases again. And it's frustrating because we've all been home since March and it's,
Yeah. No end in sight. So
yeah, same here.
So I can see like attendees pouring in, and just for the interest of time, because I think we have three interesting panelists and there's a lot to cover. So I think like we can just start. So I think let's start. I think the recording is on. So good morning, good evening to everybody, depending on which side of the globe one is present. I'm Aditya Jagati. I'm the director at Busara. And I also have with me Anisha, who's Busara's labs director, and Divyani of India Behavioral Economics Network. And on behalf of Busara Center and India Behavioral Economics Network, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you for this webinar. As you know, in the previous set of webinars, we've heard experts speak about the psychological factors affecting the success of measures to decrease the spread of COVID. Then we saw the dynamics around charitable giving. And 2 weeks back, we understood measures to decrease, from Professor Christina Bicchieri, what social norms are and what they mean in the current times. So I think it's only fitting that we attempt to pick up from where we left. We know that social norms, and particularly gender norms, are dynamic. So it's not only important to understand what they are at a point in time, but also its trajectory, which brings me to the question, are gender roles changing? And if yes, in what direction? It's also timely that we discuss this since the world is changing. We're seeing different terms being coined every day. The new normal, before Christ now has a different connotation these days. So what does all of this mean for 50% of our population is definitely something that deserves more attention. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, three very, very strong women who bring with them a wealth of experience in both research and practice. So let me introduce you, Dr. Manisha Shah, who is Vice Chair and Professor of Public Policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Manisha also serves as the Director of the Global Lab for Research in Action. As a trained development economist, Manisha's primary interest and teaching interests lie at the intersection of applied microeconomics, health and development, and has led projects in various countries such as India, Tanzania, Indonesia, Ecuador, Mexico, among many others. Secondly, we have Dr. Joy Kiru, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Economics, University of Nairobi. Joy is a specialist in impact evaluation and has researched and published in the areas of microfinance, entrepreneurship, youth employment, gender, and agriculture. She's also the deputy board chair of Mavazo Institute and the chair for the strategy committee. For all you know, for others who don't have a context, Mavazo is a nonprofit organization based out of Kenya that supports women researchers by providing research grants, expert mentorship, and research dissemination reports. The overall aim is to increase the number and visibility of African women researchers. Welcome, Dr. Kiru. And finally, we have Yogita Verma, who heads the communications and resource mobilization functions at Breakthrough and is passionate about working on changing cultural norms to reduce violence against women and girls. Prior to Breakthrough, Yogita has headed the resource mobilization at Child Rights and You, where she was instrumental in steering CRY's brand impact and fundraising growth for close to 5 years. But much before that, she moved to the development sector. She spent close to a decade at Nestle India as a marketing professional. Welcome again, all three of you. So let's kick off with the resonating question, and let me ask each one of you to respond probably in 5 to 7 minutes or so. Are gender roles changing? And if yes, in what direction? So Manisha, you want to start?
Sure, happy to start. Thank you so much for having me. And I wanted to, I wanted to talk about this question that you just mentioned on gender roles changing. And I wanted to start on a positive note because I'm going to be talking about violence against women soon. And I think the place where I've seen sort of the most positive change around gender norms has been through work with young people and adolescents. And so I just want to mention two studies that come to mind if I'm thinking about sort of positive potential for change around gender norms. And one is one is a study of my own that I've been doing with Jennifer Muzz, who is an assistant professor at George Washington University. And we have had a long-term collaboration with BRAC in Tanzania. And the project was really with the sort of ultimate goal to improve sexual and reproductive health outcomes amongst female adolescents that BRAC was already working with. And we went in and, we basically, the results are from a randomized controlled trial where we went in and we randomly selected 1/3 of the communities that we were already working with. And we said, hey, in these communities, in addition to working with these adolescent females, let's also engage the boys. And so, at baseline, we asked the girls to tell us, who are you currently dating? Who are your boyfriends? And we invited a lot of these boys for an intervention that basically lasted around 10 weeks. The boys would get together, they would play soccer, but while they were playing soccer, they were also learning messages like, hey, we all gain when we protect the rights of women and girls, or always make eye contact when you're speaking to the opposite sex, or if you see a girl who's being harassed by the bus driver for sexual favors because she doesn't have money to pay for bus fare, stand up for her. So a lot of the kind of messages around like changing some of the more acceptable social norms around gender. So we went back a year later, and at Endline, in these communities where we had also worked with the young men in these communities, we found that our female sample reported significant decreases in experiencing intimate partner violence in the past year. And so that was sort of a very interesting finding for us. Another study that again comes to mind for me, which is around adolescents in India. So this is a study that is work by Divadar, Tarun Jain, Seema Jayachandran, and they're basically working in schools in Haryana. And this was a multi-year based intervention where, they're basically talking in classrooms around gender equality and social norms. And I think, again, what's interesting is they used a randomized controlled trial to look at the impacts of this work they were doing in classrooms. And again, that they do find increases in support for gender equality across both the boys and girls in these classrooms. And in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, the boys report doing things like, more domestic chores at home, for example. And so I think in terms of like the most positive change I've observed recently through studies has really been around sort of the young people and the adolescents. And I think ultimately this makes sense because it might be easier to shift some of these gender norms around people who are still young and changing, right? As opposed to thinking about like, hey, how do we shift gender norms amongst the older generation, right? Where these norms might be a bit more fixed. So with that, let me give the opportunity to the other panelists to respond.
Great, and I think when I was talking about the study, I could see Yogita smile because I know that Yogita was also involved in the study and Breakthrough was one of the partner organizations. So on that note,
I love that study.
On that note, let me pass it on to Yogita to speak more. Yogita.
Yeah, Manisha, I was so excited when you talked about the study that Seema and Diva did on Breakthrough's program. So just a little more on the program. It's a 2-year program that works with adolescent boys and girls. And I think every time we talk about gender roles, everybody talks about girls. And rarely do people realize that unless you talk to boys, and a lot of our early work at Breakthrough was really, we spoke with women and we talked about violence, and they'd always say, go talk to the men. If you want things to change, go talk to the men and change their behaviors and attitudes if you want us to be empowered. And therefore, the intervention in Haryana, which we did over 150 schools, where we reached 18,000 children. And over 2 years, we did a structured program where we went in every 2 weeks and spent 40 minutes with young boys and girls, and really looked at changing their worldview in terms of how they looked at gender stereotypes, how they question. I think the one session that I love talking about is the one which specifically talks about gender roles. And it actually asks students to say, so who cooks at home? And everybody says the mom. Who washes the clothes? The mom. Who goes, who does a lot of the cleaning? The mom. Then they say, okay, so who's when you go out and you go to a restaurant, who's usually the chef? And they look at you and they're like, the man. And then they say, so, you have a professional laundry person called a dhobi, which is a male term. So who's that? And it's a man. And then I think the penny drops for all these adolescents when they realize that work is just work. We choose to gender it. So I think over a period of time, we really saw how, adolescent behaviors and attitudes changed over 2 years. We're still following that cohort, and the attitudes have stayed. We're hoping that by the time they hit about 2021, we can see the impact it makes in their life choices and decisions. And that's something we're kind of waiting with bated breath on. But since Aditya, you said to start, again, on a positive note, I think the two notable examples from India are, one is the Manrega, which is the whole employment guarantee scheme in India, which has over 50% women's participation. And one of the things one realizes is that when you have affirmative action, when there is political will, you actually see women, even adult women, stepping into the workforce, and because it's available to them. Similarly for, say, Panchayati Raj, there's so many women, because of the 33% reservation, you see women who are heads of local administration in villages. And that's had huge impact on girls' aspirations, because girls suddenly have role models to look at in their villages. I mean, it's not like a movie that you watch which is in some city far away. It's actually happening in their village. So there is stuff to be positive about, but the rest is a lot of gloom and doom, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm gonna hand over to Joy.
Nice, and I'm glad you mentioned Panchayati Raj, Yogita, because I think in one of the studies that Busara is conducting currently, we did see how positive figures in the Panchayati Raj could actually have such a important role in terms of how generally girls and adolescent girls in particular look up to them, and what are their perceptions when they look at like really strong women leaders in the Panchayati Raj system. Very curious, passing on to Dr. Kiru, how has your experience been? You bring a completely different perspective.
Thank you very much. Probably I should add a caveat for most of the things I'll be talking today. So I begin with a very general introduction to what you've asked us about, whether gender roles are changing. But mainly when Anisha approached me, lately we've been talking about COVID, impacts on women, impacts on that, economic impacts, our impacts. So everything that I've been doing lately has been around COVID. So even when I thought about this discussion, my mind just kind of thought that we are discussing this in the context of COVID. So most of my presentation will be about gender norms and whether they are changing or whether COVID is tilting any of that, especially from where I come from and from what we are observing and from what research is showing us. Probably that is what I'm going to be talking with the rest of the talk. That is, I'll be framing my talk, or rather my presentation, in terms of gender roles and norms in COVID. But generally, are gender roles changing, and if so, what direction? Just a few thoughts on that. I want to begin by saying that gender is actually a social construction, and societies are different, and there are different contexts. I have been to matrimonial societies, and Kenya is a predominantly patriarchal system, whereby men hold primary power, dominate social and political leadership. They are the moral authority, and they have the social privilege, and they control property. That is the Kenyan. So are these roles changing? That's what That's what I think is an issue on discussion today. And I'm expecting a very interesting discussion because you're from different societies, different cultures. We are either changing gender roles or they are getting entrenched. But what are we observing? Yeah, of course, gender roles, culture changes, cultural beliefs and cultural systems. We adopt new cultures, or we keep on relaxing beliefs that we held in the past. We keep on relaxing them in preference of what we are learning in given different contexts. And that means that our perceptions, our knowledge keeps on changing on some of the things we thought, and begin doing things differently. So in that extent, generally, yes, gender norms changes, but painfully slow. Painfully slow because it takes a long time to change a cultural system and to change a societal way of thinking. Like what you have seen in patriarchal systems, for example, most of the changes we have seen, they have not come, they didn't just happen. We have made them to happen. It has involved a lot of advocacy, for example. That's involved a lot of interventions. In Kenya, for example, we've gone ahead to entrench them in our constitution, saying that you cannot have a system which has got less more than 2/3 gender. We have even gone ahead to put them in various formal documents. But guess what? They're still flouted left, right, and center. Why? Because mainly men who control those systems, they are also the ones in power. So at the end of the day, so meaning that changing gender norms has involved a lot of advocacy, has involved a lot of lobbying, and a lot of aggressive, and not just a normal advocacy, but very aggressive and very serious advocacy. And that means that yes, gender norms are changing, but painfully slow. And in some systems like the patriarch systems, where men are the referees, and they feel like changes in gender norms, and they look at it like a struggle between men and women, whereas it's not the case, but it's perceived like a struggle between men and women, whereby as men are ceding more space, or rather as women are come to the forefront and start getting to the public spaces, for example, men feel like they're losing out, that women are gaining at the expense of themselves. And because of that, there's this resistance, there's this kind of calling back on some of these things that women are asking for. So you find that yes, they're changing, but painfully slow. So maybe as we proceed, I'm very curious to hear what are some of those changes, and more specifically, has COVID entrenched them, or has it sort of brought some pleasant changes? I hear people are, not really hear, it's true that people are working from home, but what has that happened in terms of gender norms in the front and in the public? Thank you.
Very interesting. And I think Joy has set like a perfect segue into my next set of questions, something that I'm really, really curious to hear. And Manisha, it's probably to you, like, like I think that no discussion is sort of complete these days without touching on COVID-19. And I think one of the things that we hear, which is often not vocalized, is the increase in the intimate partner violence cases. I know you've done some really interesting research recently where you mentioned that domestic violence complaints increased in districts with the strictest lockdown rules. Can you talk more about like what are some of the factors you found which sort of supports this?
Happy to do that. I'm actually, since a picture speaks 1,000 words, I just wanted to see if I could share. I don't know, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this to work. Can you see a figure?
No, I think
you can't see a figure. Okay, well, let me just, that's fine. Let me just tell you about the work. So exactly as you mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work around looking at this question empirically of whether violence against women is increasing due to COVID, because I think we've all seen lots of news reports of that globally. And And so this is, given this is an area of research that we've been working on at the lab for quite a while, we thought, hey, let's try and see if we can get some data out of some countries and actually look at this question empirically. And one of the newest studies we have is actually coming out of India. And so what we do is, as of May 1st, as I'm sure many of you know, in India, the country was broken into 3 different zones, right? There were sort of red zones, orange zones, and green zones. And this was mandated on May 1 by the national government. And it basically, what it means was people living in these red zones had like the strictest lockdown rules. People living in orange zones, kind of middle, and then people living in these green zones had less strict lockdowns. And so what we do is we exploit the variation in these lockdown zones. We use complaints that are reported to the National Commission for Women. So this is, this is a commission that women can call into to complain on all sorts of different violence outcomes, right? So we look at domestic violence, we look at cyber crimes. So this is stuff like online harassment or, blackmail online, etc. We look at sexual harassment as well. And then we look at rape as well as sexual assault. And I think the results are very interesting. And so what we're basically finding is in these red zones that had the strictest lockdown, we're finding significantly large increases in women calling in and complaining, making complaints about domestic violence that they're facing within their household. In these red zones again, and this is all red zones relative to green zone districts. So in these, the other interesting finding is that you see a significant increase in cybercrime complaints. So a lot of women are calling and complaining about, being victims of cybercrime. There's also a bit of sort of, I say good news in quotes. It is good news, and I'll tell you why it's in quotes in a minute. We're also, like, during this lockdown period, the strictest lockdown, right, that happens in these red zones in May, we're also seeing significantly large decreases in rape and sexual assault. Okay, and so at least in terms of complaints being made to the National Commission in terms of rape and sexual assault. And so and these decreases in rape and sexual assault complaints are almost as big as the increases that we're seeing in the complaints made about domestic violence. And so we're thinking this is probably, and why this is good news, but good news in quotes, is that it's probably consistent with the fact that, like, women aren't leaving their houses as much anymore, right? There's a lot of decreased mobility. They're not in public spaces. They're not riding public transportation. They're not going to their workplaces. And so these are some of the places, right, where they might be experiencing some of these, these crimes. And so it is sort of interesting, right, that we're observing these decreases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. And, also I think one probably somewhat related question that I have for Yogita is that, in an uncertain time, we often see people revert to traditional roles and customs, but we also know that having a new environment can also reshape and bring into fore like newer habits, right? Have you seen any evidence or in your experience about how this new uncertainty may reshape gender-based roles and associated habits?
Yeah, so thanks, Aditya. So we've done a lot of work on violence in particular. I think Breakthrough, our genesis was really, in the whole space of domestic violence. And I think one of the things that's happened is that even where we've seen, so 30% of Indian women face violence on a regular basis in any case. What we've seen over this entire COVID crisis is 2 things. One, we've seen that there's been a huge surge. There's been a 10-year high in the number of, call-ins that have come in on the National Commission of Women helplines. And for us, we almost feel like a lot of the work, and you're talking about habit, a lot of the work that we did, to actually get women out of homes, to win them mobility, because mobility is such a hard fought victory for women and girls in India. There's an India development study which talks about how close to 30 to 40% of women and girls have to actually take permission from men and boys in the home to leave the house to go to the market or, go to a health center. So when they manage to, leave home, collectivize, get their mobility, and then a lockdown happens, it's almost like that habit reverts to the earlier kind of regressive norm that it was in. So we're really concerned right now. Similarly, on, say, women's labor participation, we already have this steeply declining, trend where women's participation in the labor force is actually declining. It's one of the few countries. We have the particular, we can boast of this, that where there are only 9 countries like Syria and Yemen, and countries that, have a lot of internal strife, where you actually have a labor force participation lower than in India. The sense is that this is going to decline even further as migrants leave the city. Many of them are women. When jobs are scarce, women will drop out of the workforce, and then be pushed home, and violence will kind of, surge again. So it's difficult to put it in the context of a habit, but we think what's happening is that you almost have a regression to an earlier norm, which was even more, cast in stone than some of the freedoms that women and girls had managed to, achieve over decades of work that, we've done with them, and civil society and governments have done with them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. To Dr. Kiru, Joy, I think, you've heard Manisha and Yogita speak, right? Given that context is so important, right? Like when we look at the nuances of gender roles, in what ways does Kenya or other countries in the African continent, in your experience, differ from India, and from the experiences that you heard about India, if at all?
Thank you very much. If you look at Kenya and India, and mainly the Asian countries, so to say, because I know we've tried a few gender models based on experiences in those countries. They're very different. I'll give a good example of the Grameen Bank, for example, by Mohammed Yunus, which was supposed to be a very big success in Bangladesh. And you find that in the beginning, when he started this, if you remember how the story goes, like that one morning, this professor finds a woman selling a few things on the streets, and he's wondering, how can you ever make a living selling a few bags of groundnuts or something like that? This is true. You can increase his stock. And so he approaches this woman, and he offers to assist. And this woman goes like, no, I cannot accept money from another man, because my husband will not be very happy with me. And then he thinks for a while, and he says, okay, I'm going to lend you the money and you'll pay it back. And so, yeah, the woman thought that probably that is more acceptable. It's not a big problem after all. And so this continued, and the demand grew, and the demand grew, and finally was appealing to donors, and finally the Grameen Bank was born. And what happened is that, that was a society just like Kenya, whereby it's a patriarchal society. Men are the moral authority. Men decide what is good. Men decide what is appropriate and not appropriate for a woman, and things like that. And so you find that what the men realize in the beginning is that if a woman is able to access this credit and to access loans and all that, men would have a share in it. Somehow they would benefit. And because of that, it was like kind of a win-win. So they could sit ground, and women got much more public space. And the civil society did not waste any time. They got in and they brought in things like family planning, education, and things like that. And every meeting began with a chant that I will educate my girl child, I will family plan, and things like that. Chanting to self-empower themselves, first to get the messages deep inside themselves. And before we know it, women were claiming space, and they were advancing in various fronts. But most importantly, access to the credit was the solidarity model, the joint borrowing. It worked perfectly there, mainly because it was believed that if a woman took a loan and failed to repay, it would cause durma, or it would cause a curse to the male community. The men would, the shame, they would lose their face. If your woman takes a loan, if your wife takes a loan of a woman you're related to takes a loan and they fail to repay, it's not just upon the woman, but also the man. He will lose his face. So because of that, the repayments among the women borrowers was sharp. Now, many of us saw that it was a big success to lend to women in Bangladesh, and we borrowed that and we brought it to us. And then we realized that really, in terms of culture, women accessing credit and all that, this thing of a curse really doesn't work very well here, or rather doesn't make a lot of sense. So you find that that model didn't work very well here, because a lot of people would take the money and even move homes. And this, I mean, what curse are you talking about? So you find that the gender norms and all that, they are not the same. They differ. And you see, most of these things, the responses, most of the outcomes are really based on cultural and what the norms are. So if you look at the COVID-19 situation, for example, if I were to bring the discussion back to that, and you want to ask yourselves, how has it affected men and women, especially here in Kenya and probably also in India? We find that the similarities that men and women, or rather women, are mainly dominated in the service sectors, which are the most hit. We're talking about education. Men, women are primary school teachers and all that, and hotels and restaurants. Men, women will be fair. You talk about if you close, if the supply chains, even the export for horticulture are disrupted, for example, the agriculture is affected. If it's affected, agriculture is mainly dominated by women. So you find that women have been adversely affected more than men when it comes to COVID-19. And they thought the economic impacts are not enough. We are talking about childcare burden. And even before I move from the economic burdens, when that men, women are mainly in the informal sector. Right now, people are not talking about buying new clothes. They're simply talking about food and healthcare, because the future is quite uncertain. Are we opening? Are we not opening? We don't know. Is life going back to what you knew it as before? We don't know. So this new normal, for example, is not very good for the informal sector. And even the interventions, sometimes they are too formal up there. The policy interventions are too formal up there, to the extent that they are not reaching women or the informal sector. So you find that women are much more affected by COVID than men. And that has meant that, and even, so what are the results in terms of gender norms? Men and women are spending more time at home in the name of working at home. But I was reading some interesting studies from India, whereby I saw women celebrating that, you see, now my husband is able to take care of the children because he's mainly working from home. My husband is able to take care of to be able to, it's involved in, can make a family meal because he's working from home. Rather, he can step in and help him in the household chores because he's working from home, or because he's much more available. For us in Kenya, it's different. And I'm sure there are many Kenyans on the forum, and probably they can pick this up during the Q&A, or rather the comment section, and say what their experiences are. But from what you have seen, men are still men in Kenya. This is a patriarchal society, and whatever advances women have made out there in terms of gender equality, it didn't just happen. We have had to fight and struggle and use formal advocacy techniques or ways to be where we are in terms of gender equality. It's not much, but it's something to look back and say, yes, we've achieved something, even though not much. But right now, even with COVID, men are still men. You know, every woman in every wedding, there's always this thing that is being said, that a wise woman builds their home and a stupid one destroys them with their own hands. It's a verse in the Bible. And that verse has been said in secular meetings, in religious meetings. And normally the burden of keeping their home is mainly placed on the woman. And so a good woman takes care of her husband and takes care of her children. It is the woman to take care of the man. And sometimes our aunties, when they're giving this good advice during weddings, is that you have to take care of your husband, because men are like your firstborns. They're your grown babies. So you must be sure that you take care of them and keep your family and keep your man and keep everybody happy. So that burden is so much placed on the woman. So even during COVID, our men are still men. For example, recently we have a forum. I teach at the university, and we have not these social forums whereby it is just you interacting with one another. And so the women started saying that really COVID, the work burden has tripled. That's what you say, just a discussion that really the work burden has tripled. There are this webinar after webinar, writing grant after grant. But then the children, and especially for those of us with children who are starting to learn online, I realize that the burden is squarely on the women. You have to ensure that your children have got the gadgets, the computers, the tablets to be able to join classes. And the small ones, you have to help them. And if a mother is not available, is not, most of the times the children are not. And the men chipped into the discussion and they said, one after the other, that job, I've left it to my wife. I've left it to my wife. Then one man said, my wife works at an international organization and there's a time difference. So she's also working, and I'm there to make sure that our children are online learning and not on YouTube. And then every other man was on his case saying, uko na umama. Umama in it's a Kiswahili word that means that you have a woman-like behavior. It's a very intimidating thing to tell a man that he has he's woman-like, he's womanish, so to say. You're womanish. It's like an insult. So every other man is like, so all the other men here are doing good. And then I'm the one who said, oh my goodness, I think I should get a wife now. Because if a wife affords so much luxuries to the men, why don't I get one? I was just getting amazed of how a wife has become like a machine to make work easier for men and to take a lot of burden, especially during these stressful periods. So the point is, even during COVID, our men are still men. And that's at the university. And I'm talking about experiences and discussions happening on a university platform. We are supposed to be the elite of the society, right? There's also another platform where my children go to school. And when you start interacting in the forum, it's mainly mothers, because actually the burden of online learning has shifted from the schools to the parents and to the women. I don't know about India, because mainly it's a women's forum. You find that it's women who are concerned, because teachers are passing assignments that they can only contact the parents, not the children. So all the assignments for all my children are coming through me, through my phone. As I write my grants and do my online teaching and research and all that, I must also be on social media to find out what assignments have come. Are all my children logged in, and are they really doing the study? And my husband is a man, just like the other men in Nairobi. He's a man. It's a weakness if a man has got womanish behavior. So is to ensure that it's the money being paid. If I say there is no gadget, that one we can discuss. But it's not possible to discuss whether assignments have been passed or whether, and that is happening with all my colleagues. So you find that women are really kind of stressed, you know. Women are kind of stressed. And you find that on top of that stress, now for those sharing those spaces, it has come with other experiences. Somebody on our forum also was brought in an experience with one of their neighbors, and the children were like, you see, normally Nairobi there's a lot of traffic, I'm sure, like many other cities and around Africa. So men wake up to go to work very early and they come back later in the evening. But the lateness, the leaving early and coming back later, is mainly more of a man's thing than a woman's thing. So because COVID, many men are working at home. Experiences that they were by children asking their mothers, oh, is daddy starting to live with us now? Because as far as the child is awake, daddy's left. By the time she's going to bed, daddy is not back home. So she sees daddy maybe over the weekends. So it's like, so daddy is living with us full time now, mommy. So isn't there such shock that is an extra person, and that comes with this extra, we are sharing spaces now. And people are not used to that. There's strange, there's this online learning, and there's this man who still needs to be pampered. You can imagine doing your research, writing your grants, your online teaching, ensuring that your children are learning and you are passing assignments. Like we are saying that the workload for us has actually tripled as women. that's what we are feeling, that the workload has tripled. So, and then there's this man all of a sudden, please bring me a cup of tea.
Hold that thought, because before it becomes even more interesting,
Yeah.
I would like others to pitch in as well. So I think there's another question that before we move on to the Q&A, like I think another quick round of questions. Manisha, you said in your paper that attitudes towards domestic violence play a really important role in the reporting and incidents of domestic violence during the lockdown.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Yes, happy to talk more about that. And before I start that, I wanted to tell Joy that the thing you described about the schooling issue right now and the children, this is not unique to Kenya. We discussed this in Los Angeles as well, that it's all the mothers who are talking about schooling for their kids. I'm on a WhatsApp group, and it's supposed to be parents, but it's like 25 women. It's all mothers. And so we sort of joke about this. Anyways, so getting back to this study. So one thing we look at, so India has this NFHS data, which came out in 2015, 2016. And it's nice because in this latest round, this National Family Health Survey, they go to all districts, almost all districts in India. And one of the questions that they ask in this survey of the men is basically this question of like, how justifiable do you think it is for a husband to beat his wife, right? And so you get kind of the male perspective on, is it okay for men to beat their wives? They also ask women the same question of like, how justifiable is it, do you think, for like husbands to beat their wives, right? So you get a sense of kind of how acceptable women think it is to be beaten by their husbands. And so what we do is we generate kind of an average of this variable by district. And what's really interesting is what we find is that in districts where men think it's acceptable for husbands to beat their wives, you see in these red zone districts, right, where we're already observing increases in domestic violence, you actually see more increases in domestic violence in these districts where men think it's okay to beat their wives. What's also really interesting, though, is in these districts where women think it's okay for them to be beaten by their husbands, in these red zone districts, what you're actually finding is fewer complaints made to the National Commission of Women around domestic violence. And so the idea here is that, like, if women think it's okay, it looks like they're less likely to be reporting domestic violence. And if men think it's okay to be beating their wives, in those places, you're seeing more domestic violence. And so, the sort of attitude question is really important from two perspectives, right? It's really important from a reporting perspective, because if you're one of these women who sort of thinks it's okay for men to beat their wives, you're a lot less likely to report what's happening in your household. But it's also really important from like an incidence measurement issue, right? Like if we actually want to get what is the actual incidence of domestic violence in these places where kind of reporting is changing depending on like what your attitudes are, or if you're a man, right, like how much you're doing it is changing depending on what your attitudes are. This also really affects the data. And so I think one of the big messages from this work has been that these sort of the attitudes, right, the social norms that people have about how acceptable it is to kind of either engage in violence as a perpetrator or receive violence really matter a lot in our measurement and in how we think about these issues and maybe even policies.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Manisha, I think my next question is to Yogita, and I can also see that there's a bit of an overlap with with some of our audience question, is that, last webinar that we had with Professor Christina on social norms, what she mentioned is part of a study that she did in India around the total sanitation campaign. She said that, while we tend to use a lot of social media and presence of important personalities and celebrities, for instance, we have Amitabh Bachchan and Akshay Kumar and the likes, to really promote the use of toilets. in her opinion, maybe celebrity presence hasn't really been very successful in this. And given that you've done a lot of work on social norms, on gender norms, wherein, your role of media has, use of cinema, role of media, entertainment is always one of the ideas that, generally comes to the fore. How do we navigate market forces if, if these are some of the problems, and like what would be your solution to effect with media in overcoming gender norms?
That's a cool question. Thanks, Aditya. So I think on celebrity usage, I actually concur with that, because I think what often happens when you bring in like an Amitabh Bachchan talking about, Swachh Bharat, it makes it so distant, it doesn't find connection with your own local context at all. And what we found, at least on social norms, is that if the norm is your local context and your local community, and people whose opinion you care about, people whose voices you want to hear and you want ratification from, if they start giving you messages which are more positive in group scenarios, that's when things start changing. In the case of violence, for example, and Manisha, you've been talking a lot about violence, we've actually found that if you show films that demonstrate extreme violence, yeah, it actually goes the other way. And when you're prescriptive about, oh, you shouldn't do this, in some senses, it endorses lesser violence in homes. So in a sense, it's like, oh, they're doing so much, minus, it's much lesser. So norms are really tricky and very complex, and you really have to look at what's happening in the group scenario, in your local community. And in all the media work, and Breakthrough's done tons of media work. All our media work is actually used as a way to endorse work that we're doing on the ground. So it's almost like you're hearing something around you, and then you hear Amitabh Bachchan saying the same thing, and then the penny drops, in a sense, as opposed to just a single voice from very far away. So I think the choice of who those champions are at a local level really defines what happens. And examples and role models really change how people behave and think, but they need local role models in local contexts.
No, I think that's super interesting. One question for Joy. Joy, you had superb anecdotes about Kenyan men and the roles, and how men perceive their roles versus their wives' roles. Let's talk about solution, right? Like, what do you think policymakers need to keep in mind regarding, say, all aspects? For instance, like, say, social protection, right? Cash transfers, other sort of policies, to make sure that, we are actually meeting this evolving difference and not really heightening them further.
Thank you very much. About gender policies for gender and COVID-19, for example, you find that what the policymakers are doing, just like Kenya, and because this really fascinated me, because Kenya, we are a leader, or rather, we thought we are leading in the region in terms of issues of in gender mainstreaming, that is mainstreaming the voices of women in the various policies. And every time you hear that women play a key role, they provide 70% of the workforce in agriculture. They provide 89% of all the informal sector employees, which is the biggest employer in Kenya. That is the informal sector. That we have all these things about good things about women and why we should mainstream gender. But now you find that this COVID problem has actually exposed our underbellies in terms of policies. Most of these policies, like I said, they are not even, they have nothing, they are not gender mainstreamed, for example. You expected an area like, for example, if you talk about access to finance, for example, the bank rates have come down, which is a good thing. I find that there is cheap credit, there is quantitative easing and provision of cheap credit, which is a good thing. But you find that many women are actually not banked in the formal sector. But the policies don't take care of that, finding out what is there for women collectives in terms of access to finance. Because many women access finances through the informal collectives which have been registered and formalized one way or another. There is nothing in terms of access to finance for the informal for people who are in the informal sector, or rather who are informally banked through the collectives and another organization. In Kenya, we call them chamas, that is women collectives. We call them chamas. You find that again, if you look about again in the social front, in the agriculture sector, even the budget, the allocations have been reducing. And even the little that is allocated is mainly for the large-scale agricultural systems, nothing for the small-scale small-scale subsistence sector, which is mainly dominated by women. You find that these women, much as they are the core food producers, they are still working using very backward technologies. For example, technologies which are being used over 300 years ago, they're still being used even by women. That is the BC technologies. That is, you're talking about donkeys plowing, you're talking about all the symbol O and all that. It's what women are using. Access to credit, access to inputs. There's a lot of inequalities in terms of gender in the agriculture sector. So you find that most of these policies actually are not mainstreaming gender, despite all the talk about gender mainstreaming. So we need to see a case whereby we need to do what we've always done to get what we need, raise our voices and speak out and lobby the policymakers to ensure that, just like we are promised in the Constitution and the various documents and the various commitments, that you're going to mainstream gender issues in policies, that even the COVID-19 stimulus packages and all the policies for COVID-19, they follow the same, that there are issues of gender, because it looks like actually all the strides we had made in terms of women economic empowerment and gender equality, COVID-19 is actually undermining them one after the other before our very own eyes. Are we going to sit back and watch as these things happen? And policymakers, like we've known, they won't just do it until we come out, raise our voices, push and lobby and do whatever we need to do until our voices go there and we get gender mainstreaming. Because as I finish, it's not about poor women, you pity them. Gender mainstreaming is good for the society, is good for the economy, is good for all of us. Studies show that just by reducing gender inequalities, their economic growth increase, and that is good for everyone. So we need to lobby out for policies to take care of that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joy. I think lots of great points there. I'm trying my best to wrap up some of the audience questions onto the question that I asked. And I think one of the really interesting questions that comes here from Rachana, and probably I'll direct it to you, Yogita, is that, just like working with men and boys will bring structural changes, and that's what we've discussed so far, maybe bringing in men consciously speaking on gender issues on such platforms could really help. And to see three strong women here is, of course, great. But what's a take on that? Of course, it's something that the host should be, thinking more about. But what's a take on that?
That's a question for you, Aditya.
Actually,
but I do think that if you're going to discuss gender roles, and it's interesting to have a man's perspective on it as well. In some of the work we've done with men and boys, and we did we've done a lot of insight mining when we've worked with them, and some of the things that we found for gender and why gender roles are so ossified in a sense are that boys grow up with so many pressures as well, particularly around the whole area of success and performance and competition, and the whole social construct of am I man enough, and how the way you engage with a woman or a girl when you're not violent, how it emasculates you, when you're not dominant, how it emasculates you, and how you're constantly proving yourself in a sense to look superior, and the pressures of always looking like you're the provider. So it's very difficult to talk about women in isolation. You really do have to look at what the pressures on the other side are and how do you provide solutions to that, because otherwise you're speaking in a vacuum. So it's in a sense a valid point.
Absolutely, and point well taken for next rounds of webinars, Rachna. Maybe I think another question for Dr. Manisha. Is it possible to change the minds of women matriarchs on the seriousness of domestic violence and marital rape?
This is a great question. And in fact, it's something that we've been thinking about doing some research on, because our understanding is a lot of the things that happen in households and decisions that are made are actually made by sort of the matriarch or the mother-in-law or the sort of senior woman in the household, right? And I started this off by saying it's much easier to kind of change the hearts and minds of young people. And I honestly think this is a much needed area of further research. You know, we've actually been thinking about like, hey, can we actually get into some of these households and try interventions where we're basically talking to mother-in-laws, right? And saying like, hey, a lot of, you know, we will often talk to mothers about investing in their children, for example, right? When we do it, but maybe some of these investment decisions are actually being made by the men or the mother-in-laws or other individuals that might have more power within the household. And so I think this is an excellent question. I think this is a very understudied area and something we definitely need to look into more, because I think a lot of the outcomes that we care about changing are definitely related to, you know, sort of social norms and issues that the matriarch within the household has a lot of control over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just like scrolling through some of the questions. I feel like a lot of the questions have already been answered, and if not, we'll definitely reach out to you and make sure that we have an answer, and that'll be directed back. I think we have 4 minutes, but I want to take like 1 minute each of your time. And I know that we want to use this platform to also sort of form collaborations between different stakeholders and experts. And given that, you know, I can see that there are a couple of funders in the room to get today. What are some of the questions that you'd like to explore and for which you think there should be interest from interesting partners and funders? Manisha, Yogita, Joy, all three of you.
I can say a few things. I think right now, a lot of the work has been very much on these kind of short-term impacts of COVID on a lot of these, you know, gender-related norms, and I think there will be, it seems that there will be kind of longer term ramifications of these changes we're observing. You know, I wanted to start off the webinar on a positive note, but I'm very concerned that a lot of the kind of changes we're seeing due to this kind of COVID related shock, right? Of, you know, women who maybe used to participate in the labor force now have to like stop working because their kids are at home full time and someone needs to take care of them. Same thing for teenage girls, you know, teenage girls who used to be in secondary or, you know, university, who now have to drop out of school and come home to take care of younger children within the household. And so I think one, like, at some point understanding what some of these longer term impacts will look like, because only then can we think about like what the right policies will be that we can implement to sort of reverse some of the reversal that we're seeing, right? Like, I think we've been doing a great job of like getting girls into school or thinking about, you know, encouraging women into labor markets. And my concern is that some of these things might shift back. And so really thinking about like what types of policies and what types of interventions might help with this. And I think, you know, there will be funding needed around this type of research for the funders out there.
Yogita, you want to go next?
Yeah. So I think a lot of work in India has been around this whole space of getting women into the labor force through skilling and a lot of, you know, skill-based interventions. There's really not a lot of work that's been done on norms and what keeps, you know, so there's work that's been done on making sure girls get enrolled in school, some work on retention, and a lot of work on skilling, and a lot of organizations working on skilling. I think the socioeconomic context and the whole concept of why girls are not able to finally enter those jobs and why our labor force participation continues to decline despite huge investment in, the National Skill Development Council and the kind of work that's happening. So I'd really like to see a lot more work on norms and what constrains girls. So that's one. The other is a lot more work on gender norms with boys in particular. And we like to understand what are those points of intervention that can give you huge returns. We have some answers at Breakthrough. We've experimented with some, but we really think that the whole men and boys space is hugely ignored, and a lot of the answers to violence and women's empowerment and women's participation in the workforce actually lies on the other side. So to look at it a little more holistically, I think we look at everything in compartments and don't tend to look at an overall picture of what's defining how a girl or a woman works in this entire ecosystem that she exists in. So I'd like to see just more holistic interventions.
Great. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you so much. I think the issue of changing gender norms is it's important. If I remember when I was growing up, the young boys would be asked during my time now, would be asked when they are still small before they go to teenage. They'll be happy to take care of the cooking pot in the fire, add more firewood, add more water. They'll be happy to fetch water and do so-called girlish things when they're young. When they go to teenagers, they realize men don't do this, so they stop. When they're grown up, they are men and women things, men and women crops and stuff like that. End of discussion. During my time now as a mother, for example, I have socialized I'm lucky to have a boy and daughters, and I have socialized my son to do everything, to clean up, to cook, and I don't relate, especially with him, and I tell him, hey, you're not your father. You cannot do what your father is doing, and wait until you become your father. But for now, you do what I say. So, and many mothers are doing that. Our teenagers, our children, we have socialized them. There's work is work. It's for everybody. We are all the same. But are these going to be sustained? Our husbands who we grew up together, they were socialized very nicely when they were young. They got into teenagers and they unlearned everything. Now they are completely in the patriarchal world whereby you still have to push for everything. Are our sons going to unlearn these good things that we are teaching them? Our teenagers now, who are our sons, are they going to unlearn everything that you have taught them? How can we sustain this change in gender norms? I think that's a very good idea. I'm looking for a time whereby I'm going to start seeing the hashtags. It's not weak for a man to carry a baby on his shoulders. Hashtag, I'm not weak because I'm cooking for my wife. Hashtag, I'm not weak because I farm alongside. I want to see that kind of a thing whereby there is more continued support and pushing for gender norms to change and for making sure that women are not of a burden just because they are women, that women are not economically disempowered just because they are women. Because you find that even crops, there's a male crop and a women crop. The one that is commercial is a man's crop. So that a woman is a woman does not really disempower them or disenfranchise them in society. So I would like to see those campaigns. Hashtag, I'm not weak just because I cook for my wife. Thank you.
Well, on that positive note, hashtag I'm not weak because I cook for my wife. I really want to thank all the three panelists and all the attendees who patiently sat through and participated in this webinar. Just to note, the webinar recording will be out in a day or two, and as soon as this webinar ends, you all will be getting an email with the link to from where you can find the recording. Thank you so much, Manisha, Yogita, and Joy. It was a pleasure hosting you, and hope to have you again. This such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aditya, for hosting. That was great.